At 4:12 in the morning, the Eastern Pacific should have been empty. No fishing boats, no cargo lanes, just black water. Yet on the radar of a U.S. Navy destroyer, a single contact appeared out of nowhere, small and fast, cutting across the darkness where no civilian vessel had any reason to be. At first, the crew treated it like an anomaly, maybe a glitch or stray echo, because this stretch of ocean sits far beyond normal traffic, hundreds of miles from land. But the more they watched, the clearer it became that this was not an accident. The track held steady at high speed, running a route that intelligence officers had quietly flagged as a cartel corridor, a hidden highway where billions of dollars in cocaine moved north, far from the cameras and headlines. For years, the cartels believed the ocean was their safest shield, a place where law enforcement could not see, could not reach, and could not react in time. On this morning, that belief was already broken, they just did not know it yet. Instead of moving in, the destroyer's captain made a different choice. Let the boat run, study its behavior, and build a picture. Because sometimes, the most devastating answer is not to strike first, but to watch long enough to understand exactly who you are about to take apart. If you want to see how this silent hunt ends, and how the U.S. Navy is rewriting the rules of the drug war at sea, make sure you subscribe to Military Power and tell us in the comments, would you have moved in immediately or waited and watched like they did? Long before the fast boat ever touched open water, the operation had already begun. The U.S. Navy and its intelligence partners were not waiting for a radar contact or a visual sighting, because modern maritime enforcement no longer starts at sea. It starts in signals, data, and patterns, often days before a cartel crew believes they are invisible. In the weeks leading up to the launch, U.S. intelligence units monitoring known smuggling regions began to notice unusual radio traffic near a coastal departure zone in northern South America. Analysts flagged repeated short-burst communications, routed through equipment previously linked to maritime trafficking networks. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press on U.S. counter-narcotics operations, this type of encrypted chatter is often the first warning sign that a major shipment is being prepared, especially when it appears alongside sudden logistical activity. At the same time, satellite imagery picked up movements that raised further concern. Fuel bladders were staged near isolated launch points, boats were repositioned under cover of darkness, and support vehicles appeared briefly before disappearing again. These details matter because cartel vessels operating far offshore rely on precise fuel planning, and any unusual refueling pattern becomes a digital fingerprint. U.S. defense officials have confirmed in multiple briefings that satellite surveillance plays a critical role in identifying these preparations well before a vessel ever leaves shore. While the smugglers focused on speed and secrecy, a P-8 Poseidon aircraft was already at work far above the ocean. Flying at high altitude and blending into routine patrol patterns, the aircraft quietly built a detailed picture of surface activity across hundreds of miles of water. Its sensors tracked movement, wake behavior, and route consistency, allowing analysts to separate random traffic from deliberate smuggling runs. As reported by U.S. Naval Institute News, the P-8 has become one of the most effective tools in detecting low-profile vessels that once slipped through gaps in coverage. What makes this approach different is that no single moment triggers action. There is no sudden alarm, no frantic scramble when a boat appears on the horizon. Instead, every signal, image, and data point feeds into a growing assessment that assigns probability, timing, and intent. By the time the fast boat eventually moved into the Eastern Pacific, it was no longer a mystery target, but a known variable in a model that predicted where it would go and when it could be controlled. This is why U.S. forces did not rush to intercept the moment the vessel launched. Interdiction based on reaction gives the advantage to the runner, while control based on data removes that advantage entirely. Former U.S. military officials speaking to major outlets have described this method as a shift from chasing traffickers to managing them, allowing enforcement units to choose the time, location, and method of engagement. For the cartel crew, the ocean still felt wide and empty, and the absence of visible patrols reinforced old assumptions that distance equals safety. In reality, the most important decisions had already been made, quietly and far from the water's surface. The boat was not being hunted, it was being observed, measured, and guided toward an outcome the smugglers could not change. So here's the question. If you were in command, would you move fast the moment a threat appears, or would you trust the data and wait, knowing that patience might be the most powerful weapon at sea? By the time the decision was made to move in, the situation had already narrowed to a single outcome. The U.S. Navy destroyer did not close the distance because the next phase of control came from the air, where speed, authority, and visibility shift instantly. An MH-60R Seahawk lifted off the flight deck and headed toward the fast-moving contact, turning a quiet surveillance operation into direct enforcement. The MH-60R is not just a helicopter, it is a floating extension of law enforcement authority at sea. While it is designed for submarine hunting and surface warfare, U.S. officials have confirmed in public briefings that it plays a critical role in counter-narcotics missions, especially when fast boats attempt to outrun surface ships. Its value lies in endurance and control, allowing crews to match a target's speed and dictate movement without forcing an immediate confrontation. Approaching from behind, the helicopter settled into a controlled pursuit, staying just far enough back to avoid provoking a sudden maneuver, while remaining close enough to dominate the space. From above, the boat's wake revealed everything the crew needed to know. Full throttle, heavy load, no sign of fishing gear, and a course that matched known smuggling routes in the Eastern Pacific. This was not a military strike, and there was no rush to escalate. At this stage, the mission still followed law enforcement rules. The order to stop was delivered clearly and by the book, broadcast over a long-range acoustic device used by U.S. forces to communicate across open water. The message identified the United States Navy, acting in support of U.S. law enforcement, and instructed the vessel to prepare for boarding. This step matters because under international and U.S. policy, enforcement actions require clear notification and an opportunity to comply, even in the middle of the ocean. For several minutes, the crew of the fast boat did nothing. Then the engines surged higher, and the vessel began to weave, cutting sharply across the waves in an attempt to break the helicopter's control. That single choice changed the tone of the encounter. According to reporting by the Associated Press on maritime drug interdictions, non-compliance is the moment when enforcement shifts from communication to containment, allowing U.S. units to apply graduated pressure. The helicopter did not chase blindly or fire without purpose. Instead, it adjusted position, staying off the boat's stern quarter and forcing it to burn fuel at an unsustainable rate. This is the quiet advantage of air control. The smuggler must run at full power, while the aircraft chooses when and how to move. U.S. Naval Institute News has described this tactic as a way to end pursuits without turning them into firefights, especially when crews may be unarmed or attempting to flee rather than fight. Throughout this phase, the operation remained enforcement, not warfare. There were no missiles, no boarding teams yet, and no intent to destroy the vessel. Every action was designed to create compliance through pressure rather than violence. The goal was simple and deliberate. Remove the crew's options, slow their decisions, and force a stop under controlled conditions. As the helicopter maintained its hold and the boat's fuel margin collapsed, the crew below still believed they could outrun the situation. What they did not understand was that enforcement at sea is not about speed, it is about control, and at this moment, control had already shifted. So consider this. If you were in that cockpit, watching the target refuse to stop, how long would you hold the line before moving to the next level? The moment the smugglers refused to comply, the tone of the operation shifted. From the helicopter's vantage point, the decision was obvious. The crew of the fast boat believed they could still outrun enforcement, relying on the same tactics that had worked for years across the Eastern Pacific. Their engines roared at full throttle, and the vessel began weaving sharply across the water in an attempt to break the helicopter's control. It was a familiar move in cartel playbooks, but in this case, the confidence behind it came from assumptions that no longer matched reality. Cartel crews often bet everything on speed. Reports from the U.S. Coast Guard and the Associated Press confirm that go-fast boats are designed for one purpose: to move drugs rapidly over long distances while avoiding patrol ships. For years, the method had created a dangerous kind of mythology among smugglers who believed that if they maintained maximum speed long enough, they would eventually escape detection. Yet what they rarely considered were the limits built into their own vessels, because speed comes at a cost, and fuel consumption becomes a mathematical trap. At wide-open throttle, each outboard engine burns fuel at a rate that drastically shortens the vessel's operational time. U.S. counter-narcotics briefings have explained that these boats often carry just enough fuel to complete the journey if no interruptions occur. When forced to maneuver aggressively or run at maximum output for extended periods, their margin collapses. The helicopter crew understood this instantly because fuel is the one factor the smugglers cannot control once they leave shore. From above, the MH-60R did not need to attack. It only needed to hold position and let the numbers work. As the minutes passed, the boat's attempts to shake the helicopter grew more frantic. Every sharp turn increased drag, every burst of acceleration burned more fuel, and every mile put them deeper into a problem they could not fix. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy controlled the distance, the timing, and the tempo. The destroyer had the ability to refuel the aircraft, extend the chase indefinitely, and coordinate assets over a vast operational space. This created a one-sided contest where the smugglers were racing a clock that the Navy had already set. This was not a Hollywood-style pursuit, and it was not a test of horsepower. It was a process of controlled exhaustion, a tactic repeatedly documented in reporting by U.S. Naval Institute News, where aviation units apply constant pressure until the target's fuel limit forces a stop. The smugglers believed they were choosing the direction of the encounter, but in truth, each decision narrowed their options. Their strength, which they believed was speed, became the very weakness that ended the run. As the boat pushed harder, the cockpit of the helicopter remained calm. The crew monitored the vessel's behavior, calculated the likely burn rate, and watched for the moment when physics would overtake desperation. The smugglers had entered the encounter thinking distance was safety, but distance only mattered if their engines could carry them through it. Without the ability to refuel, and with no support network at sea, every second worked against them. Eventually, the telltale signs appeared. The spray behind the engines thinned, the boat's acceleration weakened, and its weaving slowed as the crew struggled to maintain control. There was no dramatic explosion or sudden mechanical failure, only the quiet collapse of a plan that depended entirely on fuel that no longer existed. This is why U.S. forces describe these encounters not as pursuits, but as managed outcomes. The goal is not to chase, but to guide the target into a situation where the only option left is to stop. At this stage, the smugglers finally understood the truth. They were not escaping, and they were not being hunted in the way they imagined. They were being allowed to run just long enough for their own vessel to decide the ending. Therefore, here is the question for you. If you were in command, would you let them burn out completely or move in the moment their speed began to fail? The turning point arrived when the helicopter crew received the next authorization, a controlled shift that transformed the encounter from verbal enforcement into decisive action. The smugglers had refused every opportunity to stop. Their fuel margin was collapsing, and their weaving attempts no longer masked the fact that their vessel could not sustain the pace. According to reporting by the Associated Press on similar interdictions, this is the stage when U.S. forces escalate through a structured ladder of response, ensuring that every step is justified and proportional. The helicopter adjusted position once more, holding steady over the runner's stern, as the gunner prepared for precision fire. The goal was never to harm the crew. U.S. counter-narcotics procedures require forces to disable the vessel, not the individuals on board, and that is exactly what happened next. The gunner aimed at the outboard engines, firing a controlled burst that struck the first motor cleanly. Pieces of metal fanned into the water as the engine died instantly. The remaining motors strained to compensate, but they could not outrun the reality of their situation. Seconds later, another shot landed, followed by a third, ending all propulsion. The boat jerked sideways and lost momentum completely, drifting helplessly as waves pushed it into a stall. The smugglers' final advantage had disappeared. Once the vessel stopped, the tactical priority shifted to securing the scene safely. The helicopter maintained overhead watch while the boarding team launched from the destroyer, closing the distance with a rigid hull inflatable boat. The smugglers did not resist at this point, because the fight had already ended when their engines failed. Crew members were restrained and transferred aboard the U.S. vessel, where they were processed under standard law enforcement protocols. Arrests of this type are frequently documented in U.S. Coast Guard reports, which detail how interdiction teams secure suspects before moving to evidence collection. That evidence was significant. Stowed under tarps and secured inside compartments were roughly 2.8 metric tons of cocaine, a haul consistent with large-scale maritime shipments described in Department of Homeland Security releases. Packed tightly to maximize space and shielded from quick detection, the cargo represented tens of millions of dollars on the U.S. market. Yet at sea, its value meant nothing. Once the smugglers lost mobility, the drugs were destined for recovery, cataloging, and eventual destruction. With the crew detained and the cargo seized, the final task was to deal with the vessel itself. Damaged, dead in the water, and stripped of illicit material, it posed a risk to maritime traffic. As noted in past statements by U.S. naval authorities, vessels in this condition are often scuttled to eliminate navigational hazards. The same procedure was followed here. After all required documentation was completed, the ship was sunk under controlled conditions, leaving nothing behind that could threaten passing vessels. This sequence may seem dramatic, but it is textbook interdiction, the kind that U.S. forces have carried out for years across the Eastern Pacific. It follows a predictable structure: identify, warn, disable, board, seize, and secure. The efficiency comes not from overwhelming force, but from discipline and coordination. Each step is designed to minimize risk while maximizing control, ensuring that traffickers cannot escalate the situation or endanger themselves or others. The smugglers believed the ocean would protect them, that speed and distance would create safety. Yet in this encounter, every layer of their strategy unraveled once the Navy exerted full control. The helicopter's precision fire did not just stop their escape. It ended the myth that mobility alone could defeat modern enforcement. Therefore, consider this. If interdiction can be this clean and this decisive, what does it mean for the cartels that still believe the ocean belongs to them? For years, maritime drug enforcement followed a familiar pattern built on interdiction, boarding, and arrests. Yet by late 2025, that model began to shift in ways that few outside military circles fully understood. According to reporting from Reuters and statements cited by major U.S. outlets, cartel networks were no longer operating as loose smuggling crews, but as organized, violent groups using semi-submersibles, encrypted communication systems, and coordination methods similar to those employed by armed militant organizations. As their tactics expanded, so did Washington's response, and the result was a historic change in how the United States handled certain vessels at sea. Instead of relying solely on boarding teams, the U.S. military began classifying specific maritime assets as hostile. This did not apply to every fast boat or suspicious craft, but to vessels that matched intelligence profiles linked directly to transnational criminal organizations involved in large-scale violence and fentanyl distribution. Once a vessel met that threshold, the rules changed drastically. U.S. policy allowed for immediate action under Department of Defense authority, transforming what had previously been a law enforcement encounter into a military decision. In these cases, the objective was not arrest or recovery, but neutralization. When surveillance confirmed origin, route, and affiliation, the vessel was marked for destruction. Reports from the region describe multiple incidents in which semi-submersibles leaving Venezuelan or Central American waters were tracked for hours and then eliminated at sea once they entered deeper water. There was no attempt to hail or board. The U.S. aircraft responsible simply executed the strike and moved on. Survivors, when recovered by foreign authorities, rarely appeared in public documentation afterward. This new approach emerged because the previous system had limits. Interdiction requires proximity, manpower, and boarding conditions that can be dangerous when crews are armed or acting unpredictably. In contrast, maritime denial aims to remove platforms before they ever reach operational zones, striking at the logistical foundation rather than chasing individual crews. As described by defense analysts in U.S. Naval Institute publications, the strategy treats smuggling networks as integrated systems rather than isolated boats, and that shift has a measurable impact. The results appeared quickly in intelligence assessments. Routes that had once been active saw long periods of silence, and communication spikes that usually preceded launches began to drop. Cartel financiers experienced losses when vessels did not return, and unlike seized boats, destroyed ones left no salvageable material for rebuilding. Insurance, informal or otherwise, does not exist for assets that vanish without warning. As a consequence, operational costs rose sharply. Crews demanded more money for increasingly dangerous runs, yet the profits fell because fewer shipments survived the journey. By shifting from interdiction to denial, the U.S. Navy forced cartels into a position they had never faced before. Distance no longer offered safety. Speed no longer guaranteed escape. Even semi-submersibles, which once slipped beneath conventional radar coverage, became vulnerable as acoustic signatures were cataloged and pattern analysis improved. Each time a vessel resurfaced to recharge batteries, it revealed enough information for U.S. forces to classify and eliminate it before it could disappear again. This strategy also carried a deeper message. Destroying assets without boarding removed the sense of negotiation or capture that traffickers had come to expect. There were no warnings, no staged showdowns, and no dramatic chases. Instead, the ocean itself became a controlled environment where hostile vessels simply ceased to exist. U.S. officials emphasized that these actions targeted equipment, not civilians, but the psychological effect rippled through smuggling communities from Central America to the Caribbean. As a result, the balance of power along maritime routes changed decisively. Traffic decreased, loads shrank, and the risk equation shifted so heavily against cartel operations that many groups paused offshore activity altogether. The ocean, once considered their safest corridor, now belonged to a network capable of seeing them long before they ever touched open water. And so the question becomes unavoidable. When denial replaces interdiction, how long can smuggling networks survive a battlefield they no longer understand? By the time the operation closed at 6:47, the story had traced a full arc from discovery to interception and finally to a new form of control. What began as a distant radar contact turned into a precise takedown, and that takedown became part of a wider shift in American strategy. Reports from outlets like Reuters and the Associated Press confirm that the United States no longer treats every cartel vessel as a criminal case. Some are now handled as hostile platforms, eliminated before they ever threaten the coastline. That shift marks the end of the belief that speed and distance can protect smugglers. Across the Eastern Pacific, the message is unmistakable. The ocean is no longer a sanctuary, and the old rules that cartels relied on have collapsed under a system that sees them early, tracks them constantly, and decides how the story ends long before they realize they are being watched. From the initial signal intercept to the helicopter's engine disablement and the destruction of hostile craft, each step proves that maritime space belongs to whoever controls time, information, and escalation. If you want more real operations like this, make sure you subscribe to Military Power. And here's the question for you. If the United States continues destroying cartel vessels instead of boarding them, will the ocean routes disappear entirely, or will the cartels attempt something even more extreme?